Hello everyone, it's Jay and welcome to another bookish video by me. In this video I'm gonna talk about the Stephen King books that I have read, and just a disclaimer, I'm a bit exhausted and sick today, so if the energy is a little off, I hope I can still manage to film this fine. And mug of the day is just like these two cups because I had to power up today, so I'm having an extra coffee in this Star Wars cup and tea in this Doctor Who cup. So yeah. So first I'm gonna start when I start reading Stephen King, just a little introduction to this. So it's pretty obvious that I'm a fan of Stephen King's because I like to read and I love horror. So it makes sense. Like every other basic bitch who likes to read and likes horror I have also read a couple of Stephen King books. Specifically, I've read 12. So I'm gonna talk about these 12 books in this video. I was introduced to Stephen King. Well, I've known of Stephen King for a long time. Of course, I did. My first horror movie that I watched was It. But I never read any books until basically my early adulthood. And I just never got to read Stephen King because honestly, I am not a huge fan of thick books, which is like I always thought it was so embarrassing to even admit, but it's true. I just don't have a very good attention span. I'm more of a slow reader, but I still love to read, and there's nothing wrong about preferring thinner books, honestly. And Stephen King isn't really known for having very many thin books, so I never got around reading his books because I was like, I don't have the brain capacity to read 1,000 pages of a book. But I was recommended some of his books by an girlfriend of my cousin at the time, and she was like, "Yeah, these books are thinner. You can try them, and then maybe you work your way up to the thicker books by Stephen King." And on the topic, I'm wearing a It hoodie, which is very ironic because I haven't read that book. Actually, I started a book. I started 50 pages and then I just forgot about the book. Maybe because it has like over 1,400 pages and I indeed have not worked myself up to that yet. So you have some general idea about my reading habits and so on. And now I think I can talk about the actual books. And slight trigger warning, some of the topics of the books, like I'm not gonna be getting deep into the books because obviously I'm talking about 12 in this video and it would be 10 freaking hours long, so I'm not going to do that. But some trigger warning for mention of SA, and of course some darker topics because this is horror and sometimes it can be a little brutal. So the first book, I tried to put these books in the order that I've actually read them, so I can reflect a little better. And mind you, some of these books I read a couple of years ago, so I don't remember them so well. And it was the classic Pet Sematary. I have this book here. I've read most of these books in Czech, but I have read some in English, and I'm gonna mention which ones I have read in English. But this one I've read in Czech. It's Pet Sematary, and it's like not that long, so that was ideal for me. It just has a little over 330 pages, so that's like the good limit for me still, so that's fine. And I'm gonna quickly tell you what it is about. And the short description is: after a tragedy strikes, a grieving father discovers an ancient burial ground behind his home with the power to raise the dead. So yeah, why is it called Pet Cemetery? Because it has some stories about like um pets being buried and then coming back from life, but the general idea is what would happen if that happened with a human being dying instead of your pet. And it's brilliant. Until these days, this is like still one of my top 3 Stephen King books for sure. The second book, and I sort of worked on the recommendation of the thinner books. So I have read indeed another thinner book by Stephen King. It is just 220 pages, and it's called The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. Um, Also, before I continue on with what this book is about, I want to say there are certain themes that you start noticing after reading a couple of Stephen King's books. So I've written down some, and it's like Maine, the state of Maine, that I honestly, as a European, didn't even know existed until I started reading Stephen King. Not gonna even lie, but it's because he's from that state in the US. So most of his books actually take place in the Maine. In Maine, another topic is baseball, writers. These also make sense because Stephen King is a big fan of baseball and Red Sox. Writers because he's an author himself, so it makes sense. And madness, I thought that was a good one to mention in here. And now I'm gonna tell you about this book. A 9-year-old girl gets lost in the New Hampshire woods, and that's it. That's the description. What is this book about? It's about girl getting lost in the woods. That's what it is about. And this book sort of made me realize the weirdness of Stephen King, because a lot of his books also don't have the typical structure. I think Pet Sematary did have a really good structure, but this one's way more confusing, and I loved it first time reading it, but also it made me a little confused because you keep expecting what the hell happens, and it's just the story of the girl getting lost in the woods, and then spoiler alert, I guess, but in the end she gets found, and that's what this book is about. And what I love about Stephen King's writing is that whoever he writes as, it's so believable because the style of writing was like, yes, this is what a 9-year-old girl would think like, or at least I believe so. It's about like these confusing thoughts because this is what the girl sees, but also she's 9 and she's lost. So maybe that's just how child's thoughts would go, and maybe there's actually nothing happening in this book, but it also might be something really dark happening in this book. It's very hard to describe, but loved it. Third book is called Full Dark, No Stars, and this one is actually 4 different stories in a book. I must admit, I didn't remember a lot of these stories. I very much remember the first one, which is called 1922. And the general description is a man who succumbs to the violence within goes on a train of murder and madness. Madness, as I was talking about, very much. And the thing is, once again, as I mentioned, that King makes it believable, writing for whoever, and also kind of disturbed me in the book because the guy is describing his insane thoughts, but because it's so well described, you almost sort of understand where he's coming from, even though he's literally being mad. And that was really cool about this story. And now, as I mentioned, there are 3 other stories that I didn't remember very well, so I'm gonna through them pretty quickly. So the next story was Big Driver, and it's about a female writer seeing the patterns, who is R-worded and seeks revenge. And it, when I read what these stories were about, it made me remember a bit, for sure, but like I don't remember much details about it. But yeah, wouldn't recommend that one if you don't like these kind of topics. But I'm gonna mention in which books and stories there were, so you can avoid them if you need to. The third story was called Fair Extension, and it is a story about man with a cancer who makes basically the deal with the devil to extend his life. And that's an interesting topic because how many of us can really imagine what that's like, right? And if that's something we would be capable of doing, and what thoughts bring you there, basically. And the last story in this book is called A Good Marriage, and the description is basically a woman's husband goes on a business trip, and she goes to the garage for some reason, and she discovers stuff about him that she didn't know before, and realizes he's not at all what she thought he is. And I think that's a really interesting idea as well. And it's kind of, my partner is a big fan of true crime, so I sometimes listen to podcasts with him, and it's always really fascinating when it turns to turns out to be your husband who's a serial killer, for example, and you just like, how truth can it be? How can you realize that someone as significant in your life as your husband is actually insane? And that's, I just like the idea of it. So that's it for this book. Next book is actually also a series of more stories, except this is just 2 stories, and it's the first book from the series 4 Past Midnight. It looks like this, and I'm gonna mention you the 2 of the stories. So the first story was once again completely different from any I've read by him, because it actually is more of a sci-fi with some horror bits in it. It's called the Langoliers, and it's actually about a flight going from LA to Boston, but the plane actually flies through a strange light, causing the passengers and crew to disappear, leaving behind only their personal belongings. And the other description that I thought was also pretty important, because there are more characters in this book. So this, and one of the significant characters that you actually hate is a man. He was also described as a irritable banker who has a breakdown, and he believes in the Langoliers, which are monsters that he was afraid of as a child, and they're supposed to attack those who waste their time. And I was very confused with the story for a long time, but it turned out to be really worth it, and it turned out to be a pretty freaking cool story, even though it was once again different from other stories I've read by Stephen King. But it turned out to be really cool. So sometimes there's just the long beginning period where you're just confused and you don't know if, like, what the fuck is gonna happen, like, is this worth reading? But I must say it most certainly is worth reading. And the second story of the book I also really enjoyed. It was called Secret Window, Secret Garden. A man is accused, he's a writer, and he's accused by another man for stealing his writer's ideas. And the writer, the main character, is actually going through a rough patch in his life. He's going through a divorce, and suddenly this mysterious man shows up, and he's telling him that he's actually, like, just been stealing his ideas for books, and he is trying to prove this man wrong. But he's very confused about, like, is this man even freaking real, because everything about is so weird once again. And I think this is once again the topic of, like, slipping into madness. I just love his description of, like, people slowly slipping into madness, and you're going there right with them, and it's kind of amazing. The next book I've read by Stephen King was the first book I've read in English, actually, and it's called Dr. Sleep. And if you know anything about Stephen King's books, then you know it's actually a sequel to The Shining. And you might be asking, have you read The Shining first? No, I haven't. I actually, first, I've read Dr. Sleep. Of course, I know the movie Shining, and it's one of my favorite horror movies, but I haven't read this when I was reading this one. So it's a sequel to The Shining, and it's about their son, Dan Torrance, who falls into alcoholism, and he meets and he has the gift of The Shining. If you know from at least the movie, then you know he has the gift of Shining, and he basically meets this, like, teenager girl who has the same gift, and there turns out to be, like, a cult who basically is trying to use people like them and steal their powers, and they're like life force, or I don't know how to call it. They were basically like vampirish, but like no blood involved, just eating up their force or energy force. Like, I'm thinking about freaking Star Wars, aren't I? this has absolutely not reached The Shining for me. It's definitely not as good, but that doesn't mean it was a bad read. It's just because I love The Shining so much. And I'm going right to it because, of course, I turned out to be curious about it, and I finally read The Shining, and this is a classic, and I realize my taste is really basic in his books, I suppose, but I'm just saying that the classics are usually classics for some reason, and I love The Shining. I loved everything about it. The short description is Jack Torrance and his family, his wife and his son, who is that Dan Torrance, who is the main character of Doctor Sleep, and they move to the hotel Overlook, and of course it discusses the gift of shining, ghosts, uh, themes of alcoholism, isolation, and who would have guessed, madness. A lot of this book is set throughout winter, and I think it's really great. I just love this book. This is definitely one of my favorite books by him. Definitely go for this one, especially if you love the movie. Like, the movie is great, but it does not compare to the book. The book is amazing. Read the book. The next book is yet another classic, and it's the first book that Stephen King has written. And of course, it's Carrie. So that's another book I have read in English, and it's about a high school girl with crazy, abusive, manipulative Catholic mother. She's just insane, basically. And there's this topic of prom, and let's just say some powers that this main character, Carrie, just finds within herself. I think it basically represents something you hide within yourself and you're not allowed to be yourself, let's just say, and going crazy from it. And just the thing that you've been concealing and hiding and keeping within yourself, and what happens when it blows up, basically. And yeah, absolutely lovely book. This one is also one of the thinnest ones. It's just a bit over, oh, it's almost 300 pages, but like for his books, it's considered pretty short, I think. And yeah, this one is also very much worth to read. The next book I've read is Salem Slot. And of course, this is the vampirish book. I have a bit of an issue with vampire books, like, because I'm so obsessed with vampires. But none of the books and movies and things about vampires just ever reach what my expectations, because I just love the theme of vampires, and of course I love that there's different outlook on vampires in every like piece of art about them. It's always different, but there's something uncomfortable about that, I guess. I don't know how to really explain this, but I love vampires so much that nothing about vampires is good enough. I don't know how else to explain it, but that's just a me problem. So what this is about, yeah, a writer once again goes back to an old house in Salem Slot, which has been haunting him since his childhood, and it's infested with vampires, of course. And then they're the bad guys, basically. Surprise, surprise, vampires are the bad guys. And then this guy basically finds a group of people who help him fight them. And it was not a bad book. It was still a pretty good read. When I'm saying like this was not my favorite, it's still usually like, it was a really good book, but just like compared to the absolute favorites of mine, it wasn't that good. The next book is probably, if not the most bizarre book that I've read by Stephen King, and it's called From a Buick 8. If you heard of this one, I've read this one in English, clearly, and it's about a car. It's about a car, and it's about a younger guy whose father died, and he was with the police. And after his father dies, he basically finds support within his father's old colleagues. So a lot of most of this book takes place around the barracks and with the police force and stuff like that. And they basically support this young guy who's lost his father, and they talk about his father to him. And basically, there is a car that is standing next to the barracks, and this young character just finds it fascinating. And it turns out that car been standing there for a real long time, and his father was obsessed with it too. And what's the mystery behind this car, and could it possibly have anything to do with his father's death? But this is the book that most reminded me of like The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. As I was saying, it's about a girl who gets lost in the woods, and that's it. It's just this girl in the woods, and there is no like actual explanation to it. So this is a story about a car, and we don't really get the explanation. And it's basically just a lot of this book is telling old stories and wondering what this car really is. Is it something from the space? Is it something demonic? And again, once more, a little like spoiler alert, I suppose. It's basically the car is supposed to be indestructible, but there's one of the characters who tells this young guy that in his opinion, he thinks there's just something that exists and we can do nothing about it, and one day it will just like slowly start dying off itself. It's really hard to explain this. And basically the end of the book is them seeing like I think scratches on this car. So like that's the first sign of the car actually slowly dying off, whatever the car actually is. And what I've read about this is there are theories that this has something to do with Christine, and I can't say much about it because I have watched the movie Christine, so I know what it is about. But I haven't read the book. Some people say it might be Christine, which is sort of the common topic. There's something strange about this car that they call Christine, and it's basically just a mysterious thing. And some people say that the Buick 8 might be like the new form of Christine, but I can't say much about this because I haven't read Christine as the book. I've only watched the movie, and the movies never really explain it that well. The next book is actually a series of many stories. It contains 20 stories within this book, and it's called Bazaar of Bad Dreams. I've read that last year, and honestly, I don't think anyone wants to hear me talking about every single story, so I'm just gonna name some stories in this. And was Smile and 81, Premium Harmony, Batman and Robin, Heaven, Altercation, The Dune, Bad Little Kid, Death, The Bone Church, Morality, and so on and so on. And I actually, for this video specifically, watched a video about this book, about a guy who talks about each story a little bit. Although even himself, he said he also doesn't remember some of the stories. Some of them just weren't as memorable. And when you read a book with like 20 stories in it, it's quite possible you won't remember all of them so well. Or maybe if you don't struggle with memory as much as like I do, maybe you will remember it better, because I'm saying it's not even that long since I've read this. It was last year, and a lot of these stories just went straight through my head. There are actually 2 poems in here, and just like the guy in the video that I watched, funnily enough, I don't understand poetry, and I just know I can never appreciate. So Stephen King was no exception with poetry. Sorry, but same thing. But some of these stories were pretty good. We have just 2 books left. So the next book was actually one of my favorites, and it's called Bag of Bones. And basically, it's once again the main character is an author. He lost his wife, she's passed away, and he has a writer's blog. He's basically going through a lot of the stages of grief, even it's been like 2 years since his wife passed, and he returns to a lake house where he always used to visit with his wife, but he discovers a lot of stuff about his wife, once again, a bit of the topic of like someone close to you is not who you thought they were, but it's not the main topic of the book. Um, there are a lot of ghosts in this book, which I love, and it's all sort of a like not a detective story, but it has some of that in it because he's trying to discover stuff about his wife and what the hell's been happening and why she has been coming back to the lake house without him and what the whole deal about that was. And he also meets this young woman who he like falls in love with, and she has a child, and the child has a bit of the same talents as the main guy, and that's like to like seeing ghosts and being basically more sensitive, I suppose, to the supernatural. um and this woman also has a crazy father, and there's just it's quite a complicated story, but it was definitely so worth it in the end. Like, it, once again, if you ask me, it could have been shorter. Okay, it could have been shorter, but that's just a personal preference, but it was still worth it. Like, this was 660 pages, so that's a thick book for me. Okay, it's a thick boy for me, but it was still definitely worth it in the end. I really loved the unraveling of all the things. It was really cool. Basically, the last book that I've read by Stephen King is called The Gerald's Game, and this one was simple when it comes to what was actually happening in this book. And so there was a couple, a old married couple, who want to just like suppose spice up their marriage, and then they like book like a romantic weekend. And that when it comes to the thingy thing, he basically puts her wife in the handcuffs, but he dies. It's not really much of a spoiler. It happens quite early on, because that's not actually what the book is about. It's about this woman getting stuck in the handcuffs and thinking. And once again, there's a bit of the insanity, I suppose, because which one of us wouldn't go insane? And it switches between her thinking about the past and processing. Actually, finally, it makes her process some of her trauma that has happened to her in her life, and it switches between that and also her and her survival instincts and what she's gonna do, because she's gonna die. She's gonna die if she doesn't get out of these handcuffs. And it's really interesting. The only like group of people I wouldn't recommend this book to is people who are sensitive about like SA, once again, and like, yeah, a lot of that stuff. It discusses a lot of that stuff, and that's very much what her trauma is also about, and it's really heavy on that side. Once again, that was a bit of a thinner book, just like over 200 and okay, almost just under 300 pages. Yeah, but very good nonetheless. And that's all the 12 books I have read by Stephen King so far. And I want to film an update once I have enough books that I've read by him, like more books. And I want to definitely make more bookish videos, and definitely more videos about like Stephen King maybe, but it all widely depends on how many books I get to read by him. Thank you so much for watching. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe. I have just like 3 people left to have it 100 subscribers. I know that's like nothing in the YouTube world, but it means a lot to me. It's still very cool. And yeah, till the next time. Bye.